Thank you for joining me. I want to talk today about a very famous debate that occurred in the mid-20th century and that has shaped the field of philosophy of law for some decades since then. It is a debate between H.L.A. Hart and Patrick Devlin, both of whom were well-known scholars, and Devlin also a practicing judicial figure in the United Kingdom. And it occurred in the aftermath of World War II, and as a historical context, it occurred at a time when certain rumblings were happening in Western culture, rumblings that eventually erupted in the 1960s in the first wave of the sexual revolution, and that involved a certain loosening of a lot of existing received understandings of appropriate sexual morality in Western culture. For starters, I want to explicate their positions and their respective positions, namely Devlin's original assertion of his views, Hart's critique of his views. And then secondly, I want to talk a little bit about Robert George's contemporary reinterpretation of Devlin and his own assertion of the appropriate foundations for morals legislation. For starters, what did Patrick Devlin exactly argue? Very famously, Devlin asserted, in response to the Wolfenden Report, a commission in the United Kingdom which concluded that certain sexual laws needed to be loosened because these laws were restrictive and damaging to individual liberty. Devlin concluded in response to this that it was essential that society have a certain established morality. And the reason why, he asserted, was because just as you need to have a common citizenship allegiance, so also society needs to have a common moral allegiance. In the absence of a common moral allegiance, what you get is a disintegration in the social fabric. So much so that he even likened that disintegration to treasonous activities. Just as a citizen who is treasonous is repudiating his or her citizenship unities with fellow citizens, so also a person who is morally deeply different from those around him or her is committing a kind of moral treason against the social fabric of society, leading to its disintegration. At the time, the idea that society could disintegrate because of the existence of dissenting moralities struck many of Devlin's contemporaries as being a little far-fetched. But it's probably not so far-fetched in a contemporary society, now some 50 or 60 years removed from Devlin's original argumentation, where here in the United States we have so many different worldviews and so many factions and so little political agreement, so many conceptions of morality, that it's not hard to imagine deep social destruction and disintegration occurring perhaps at some time even in the near future on the basis of the extraordinary differences that have arisen and now exist in the society. At any rate, though, notice that Devlin did not assert that the reason why society, and especially the government, is justified in enforcing a particular kind of morals legislation is that a particular moral view is true. Instead, the argument that he provided was based on self-preservation. It is in the interests of political governance that it preserve the society, and the way to do that, one way to do that, is by means of preserving a common morality. And that means, just like preserving common citizenship, so also enforcing certain morals legislation expectations among the citizens, prohibiting and preventing certain kinds of egregious violations and behaviors that could be damaging to the society. And of course, the background for this was the development of controversial sexual opinions at the time. This was in the 1950s when this was originally going down. Now, H.L.A. Hart was very critical of this. H.L.A. Hart is a very famous theorist of jurisprudence, or philosopher of law. In the mid-20th century, he made many contributions to the field, including his famous work, The Concept of Law. H.L.A. Hart criticized Devlin by asserting that Devlin basically just took the whole notion of social disintegration too far. there really is no such thing as a complete disintegration of society in circumstances in which morality differs among the citizens. Instead, what you get is a reinterpretation of the nature of their relational connections to each other. Hart divided morality into a couple of different kinds. Mainstream morality might be one thing and critical morality another, but critical morality, according to Hart, can exist simultaneously alongside mainstream morality in ways that do not undermine the ability of the society to function and to remain a stable order. Now, in a contemporary setting, more recently, well-known political philosopher Robert George has reinterpreted Devlin's views to assert not the harder stance that Devlin intended for his morals legislation to prevent society from disintegration. But George argues in his book Making Men Moral that it would have been better if Devlin had made the softer claim that instead the absence of morals legislation, that is the presence of disagreements morally, leads to a certain damaging of flourishing, a damaging of social fabric in a way that makes it not possible for people to flourish to the same extent that they could otherwise do if they had been able to live in a society where the morality was more uniform and less patchwork. So George has suggested, as a friendly reinterpretation of Devlin's views, that Devlin ought to have asserted the communitarian thesis that human flourishing requires a certain kind of a community involvement, that is, maximal human flourishing requires that. And in the absence of that, we human beings, while not dying or not necessarily living meaningless lives, nevertheless do not flourish to the extent that we could otherwise do if we lived in a communitarian setting where there was a common morality and a certain common way of life and way of doing things that reinforced our surroundings with stability. Now, I want to end by talking a little bit about one last thing that Robert George has asserted and is well known for defending. He is well known for arguing in Making Men Moral and in other works that the only basis for justifying the existence of morals legislation, that is, morals legislation, by that I mean legislation that is intended to prohibit certain radical moral behaviors and actively to promote a certain moral worldview. George asserts that the only reason that morals legislation can be justified, the only basis for its justification, is that the morality that the morals legislation is aimed at upholding be true. That is, the morality that the morals legislation is aimed at enforcing, since it requires coercion to pass legislation and to compel the citizens to abide by it. The morality must be true in order for the coercion of people and the minimization of their liberties, at least in certain regards, certain moral matters, in order that that be a justifiable thing. Now, George thinks that in modern Western democracies, basically the only kind of morals legislation that can be justified is morals legislation on matters that virtually all reasonable worldviews can agree upon. That is, all reasonable worldviews, George thinks, can agree that there are certain kinds of moral behaviors that are so destructive to ourselves as human beings that we can aim morals legislation at those behaviors, prohibit those behaviors, place people even in prison for doing those behaviors, or at the very least penalizing them with fines and other sanctions, and in doing so bringing about a better moral ecology. One example of an egregiously destructive moral behavior might be child sexual assault or molestation. Virtually all reasonable worldviews, George thinks, can recognize that it is wrong for adults to molest children or to assault children for sexual purposes. Maybe one worldview asserts that the reason why it's wrong is because no consent can be involved because the child is not of age. Maybe another worldview says the reason why it's wrong is because there is not some sort of a matrimonial tie between the parties. Um, and on that worldview, maybe it's only in the context of marriage that sexual behavior should be taking place. And maybe other worldviews have other reasons for rejecting the behavior of an adult sexually assaulting or involving him or herself with children as wrongful morally. The point is, for George, there's a kind of a consensus among reasonable worldviews, and as such, it is justifiable to prohibit such behavior on moral grounds because right-thinking people know it to be true that sexual morality not that is right sexual morality not involve assaulting children. Okay, so to sum up, Patrick Devlin famously argued that society can pass morals legislation and enforce it so as to protect itself and so as to ensure its own stability. H.L.A. Hart argued that no social disintegration really will take place if there are critical moralities allowed to fester and develop in a society. And Robert George more recently has argued that the only sound basis for morals legislation is that the morality in question on which the legislation is based be a true morality and not simply a morality that contributes to the stability of the society.